I got a theological question for you today. How do we seek first God's kingdom? In Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, Jesus tells us to not run after all of the things we need in life, but to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all things will then be added unto us. Well, how do you do that? What does that look like? By the way, if you watch Refuels a lot, you'll know I talked about this verse in my last refuel. You're like, what are you repeating yourself? No, I got a wholly different point here. Practically speaking, I think the key is understanding the whole chapter of Matthew 6. In fact, I want to encourage you, right after this refuel, open that Bible up, get it on your phone, read the entire chapter. And what you're going to find is there's one phrase and one idea repeated over and over and over and over. Jesus is talking about getting rid of religious hypocrisy. He's talking about not running around and striving and worrying about stuff. And as he teaches us to not be religious hypocrites and to not strive after meaningless stuff, he says this one thing over and over again. He starts in verse 4, and then he says it again in verse 6, then he says it again in verse 8, and then he says it again in verse 18, and finally, he says it one last time in verse 32. Then comes 6:33, that epic, incredible, well-known verse, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all things will be added unto you. What is it that it gets repeated? God knows, and God sees. Starting in verse 4, he says, but your Father who already knows. And then he says it again in verse 6, but your Father who sees. Then he says it again in verse 8, but your Father who knows. My friend, the most encouraging thing I can tell you this morning is this: God knows you, and he knows you better than you know yourself. And God sees. He sees every part of your day. You're never invisible to God. You're never insignificant to God. God's counting every hair on your head. He cares for you more than you can imagine. By the way, the most convicting, dangerous thing I could say to you is God knows you and God sees you. Every thought, every motive, every bit of pride and lust and greed and duplicity in us, God knows that about us. And yet, he doesn't judge us. With the knowledge of my sin, Jesus decided to come to earth and die in my place. With the knowledge of my duplicity, with the knowledge of my darkened thoughts and wrong motives and selfish actions, with the knowledge of everything I would do sinfully, Jesus said, I'll be judged. I will be the one before the judgment, and I'll say nothing. And I'll be the one to suffer and die in his place. How do we actually seek first his kingdom? Well, it starts with understanding how good he is. It starts with meditating on, realizing that God knows me better and loves me more than anyone ever could. When we get that idea that God knows and God sees, then we can lift up our view to go after his kingdom first.